Before we begin, slow down for a moment. Relax your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Grab a coffee, tea, or whatever drink makes you feel like you're about to learn something strange but delightful. Because today, we're not talking about murder, or fraud, or anything that sounds obviously illegal. We're talking about butter. Or rather, the time when the government decided that butter had a dangerous enemy, and that enemy was yellow margarine. This is the story of how coloring a food product the wrong shade became a crime, why people smuggled fake butter across borders, and how one of the strangest food wars in history played out not in courtrooms or battlefields, but on dinner tables. To understand why yellow margarine was illegal, we need to talk about fear, economics, branding, and the quiet power of something that looks familiar. Let's rewind. In the late 1800s, butter is king. It's expensive, it's traditional, and it's deeply tied to dairy farming communities. Butter isn't just food, it's livelihood. And then someone invents margarine. Originally created in France in the 1860s, margarine is designed as a cheap alternative to butter. It's made from animal fats and later vegetable oils, and it can be produced at a fraction of the cost. From a consumer's perspective, this is great. Cheaper spread, longer shelf life, similar taste. From a dairy farmer's perspective, it's a nightmare. Because margarine doesn't just compete with butter, it looks like butter. And that's the problem. By the late 19th century, manufacturers figure out that if you color margarine yellow, consumers are much more likely to buy it. White margarine looks strange. Yellow margarine looks familiar, comforting, normal. Butter-colored. Dairy interests panic. They argue that margarine is an inferior product masquerading as butter, that consumers are being tricked, that farmers are being undercut by deception rather than competition. And so they lobby. Hard. What follows is one of the most bizarre regulatory responses in food history. Governments begin passing laws not against margarine itself, but against its color. In the United States, multiple states ban the sale of margarine colored yellow. Some go further, requiring margarine to be dyed an unappetizing shade of pink. Yes, pink. The logic is simple and unapologetic. If margarine looks disgusting, people won't confuse it with butter. And these laws are enforced. Selling yellow margarine becomes illegal. Manufacturers are fined. Retailers are punished. Consumers are forced to buy margarine that looks nothing like the food it's replacing. In some states, margarine must be sold plain white, along with a small packet of yellow dye. If consumers want butter-colored margarine, they have to knead the dye into it themselves at home. This is not a joke. This is real policy. Imagine buying a product and then being legally required to manually color it so it looks edible. But it gets better. In Canada, the ban on yellow margarine lasts even longer. For decades, margarine is legally required to be white. Dairy producers argue that allowing yellow margarine would destroy the dairy industry. So Canadians adapt. They smuggle margarine across provincial borders. They bribe shopkeepers. They illegally color margarine in their kitchens. Yellow margarine becomes contraband, not because it's dangerous, but because it looks too much like butter. This creates an absurd situation where the same product is legal or illegal depending on its hue. Not its ingredients, not its safety, its color. And the justification? Consumer protection. The argument is that consumers might accidentally buy margarine thinking it's butter, which raises an obvious question. If consumers prefer yellow margarine, are they really being tricked, or are they making a choice regulators don't like? That question sits at the heart of this entire saga. Because this isn't really about color. it's about competition. Butter producers don't want margarine to be illegal, they want it to be unattractive. And governments, particularly in agricultural regions, are more than happy to help. For decades, these laws persist. Margarine is taxed more heavily, restricted more tightly, treated as a suspicious substance rather than a legitimate food. In Wisconsin, a state practically synonymous with dairy, the restrictions are especially intense. Even today, Wisconsin has laws that prohibit restaurants from serving margarine instead of butter without customer consent. That's not history, that's still real. Over time, though, things change. Vegetable oil margarine improves. Health research begins to paint saturated fats, like those in butter, in less flattering light. Consumers start choosing margarine not because it's cheaper, but because they believe it's healthier. Public sentiment shifts. At the same time, the idea of regulating food color to protect an industry starts to look ridiculous. Court challenges succeed, laws are repealed. By the mid to late 20th century, most bans on yellow margarine disappear, but the legacy remains. Because for decades, the government quite literally told people what color their food was allowed to be. And not for safety, not for nutrition, but for economics. This is where the story becomes less funny and more revealing. Food regulation often presents itself as neutral and scientific, but history shows that it's also political, emotional, cultural. Butter wasn't just a product, it was identity, tradition, rural livelihood. Margarine threatened that by being familiar enough to replace it. And so instead of banning margarine outright, which would have been unpopular, governments chose a subtler approach. Make it weird, make it ugly, make it legally inconvenient. And it worked. For a while. Eventually, consumer preference won. Yellow margarine became normal. Butter survived anyway. The dairy industry adapted, and the world moved on. But the episode leaves us with a strange question. How many other rules exist not because something is harmful, but because it competes too well with something powerful? The margarine wars remind us that legality is not always about right and wrong. Sometimes it's about which side has better lobbyists. So the next time you spread something yellow on toast, remember, there was a time when that color alone could make it illegal. If you enjoyed this story, take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who loves strange history. Leave a comment about the weirdest food rule you've ever heard of. Now, relax. Take another sip, and I'll see you in the next one.